All For One has been lying to everyone for the entire series. We all know about the glowing baby, right? The first person in history to have a quirk.
So that was a lie.
Yup, it was instead All For One who was the first quirk baby, which changes everything for my hero, by the way, as we learn All For One's backstory and how he came to become the biggest menace in the whole world. Throughout the final arc, we've seen All For One have a relatively calm demeanor. However, with All Might, he was taunting him over and over, almost like playing with his food before eventually delivering a killing blow.
Objection!
But we all know he was saved by Bakugo, who has completely turned the tide of this battle with his awakened form of Explosion. Deku and Bakugo have been holding off the two villains together, finally fighting side by side as new symbols of peace, and it's been really effective. Almost as effective as you guys clicking that like button. Deku continues to stare down Shigaraki, who keeps destroying his black whip, releasing him from Deku's hold. Shigi tells Deku that he will do it over and over again until he destroys Deku, which results in Deku deciding to use Gear Shift for one final time, basically putting the entire world's fate in this one attack. Now, this will determine the end of the battle, as no matter how long it lasts, Gear Shift will leave Deku immobilized the second it deactivates. Meanwhile, Bakugo is going absolutely crazy, as the pain of the sweat stored in his palms is flowing through his entire body, allowing him to gain complete control over his backup blast, allowing him to actually keep up with All For One in terms of speed, as Bakugo finally can overtake Deku in this moment. All For One is perplexed by him though, saying that Dark Shadow and Endeavor gave him more of a challenge. This dude literally said Bakugo isn't even on par with a broken down All Might. According to him, Bakugo is just a pebble who's not even worth him advancing his rewound state. And yet, Bakugo is the perfect foil to the strongest villain, as he resembles and reminds All For One of the man he hated more than anyone, the second user, Kudo. All For One and the first user were born from a prostitute mother. She had contracted a disease which resulted in her developing a spike-like tumor on her left arm. This disease was obviously one of the several beginnings to quirks. Along with the tumor, she realized 8 months later that she was pregnant, which makes no sense. Hey, you have two babies growing inside of you. How does it take 8 months to realize this?
That doesn't make no sense.
But here is where we get a glimpse at the start of All For One's philosophy, as he was a parasite who thought he was him since the womb days by sapping all of his mother's and brother's nutrients. Their mom would die in childbirth at a riverside, but as they were born, their mother's tumor disappeared, the only conclusion being that it was All For One who stole it. It was only a year later that the glowing baby was also born in China, resulting in the mainstream birth of quirks. These powers, identified as addition to the human genetic factor, didn't just appear in newborns, but in people who also hadn't reached puberty. However, public reception to quirks was completely different back then. When they first surfaced, it created an idea that those with power were inhuman. Now, this is just human nature. When a massive change occurs, we often like to ignore it. And this is especially the case for All For One, as he was hunted by an anti-quirk group when he was still a child. They see him as an orphan of the paranormal and don't want anything to do with him, fearing they will become infected later if they go near him. Bros really thought this man All For One was gonna start the next pandemic. Oh my god. However, All For One is having none of this slander, and so remember that quirk he stole from his mom? Yeah, well, it turns out that it's a spike quirk which he uses to kill all of them. All For One stealing his mom's quirk as a kid goes directly in line with his philosophy, as he views the entire world and everything in it as his benefactor. If you don't give him anything, power, loyalty, manpower, or anything of the sort, you are nothing more than a nuisance.
Your life is nothing. You serve zero purpose.
This is why throughout the entire series, we have seen All For One just throw things away, because they've lost their purpose. Even Shigaraki's consciousness had been deemed unnecessary for All For One, as all he wants is Tomura's body. The soul has no worth to him, so he wants to eradicate him now. All For One has a god complex, where everything is viewed as his and nobody else truly has any power of their own, only one subservient to him. There was one exception to this rule, however. His brother Yoichi. Despite being useless and not having any worth to All For One, he still kept his brother around. This is because the love All For One had for his brother was simply one of possession. He viewed the first user as his thing, and so he kept him. And it's not like Yoichi could do much about it at the time, as it's revealed in this chapter that All For One stole all of their mother's nutrients, resulting in his brother being small and frail. Yoichi even tried to stop his brother from committing evil actions, but this man just kicked him to the side and walked away. Physically, Yoichi was weak, and mentally, he was essentially trapped as All For One's thing for years. This is for sure meant to parallel our own society, as so many people are exploited, overworked, and basically seen as a tool rather than human from higher ups. Whether it be the anime industry, mappa, a desk job, or even retail, a lot of people are just considered a pair of extra hands. It's a very real issue, and Horikoshi has excellently weaved it into the story. This twisted form of love brings so many puzzle pieces together regarding All For One, but I'll be explaining that in a bit. The two brothers then listen to the radio while Yoichi reads comic books, which reveals the glowing baby is now fighting on the front lines and defending peace for his country. This shows a direct juxtaposition between the brothers and the baby, as one stands to fight for justice while the others are just doing their own thing. One for all and all for one. All For One then asks Yoichi why he's reading comics, to which the younger brother tells him it's because he can't fully read normal books yet, so he's studying with comics. Yoichi furthers this by commending how awesome comics are, how incredible it is that the author conveys his messages just through a drawing, and one day he wants to be like Captain Hero in the book. While right now just a childish remark, this action by the first user was the seed that began to implant the ideals of heroism into society. This also shows the younger brother's good nature, as he still believed that his brother could do good because he held his hand when they were little. 3 years later, and the glowing baby had gained more than 10 million followers. Meanwhile, All For One's views were plummeting, and he was getting a lot of 10 out of 10s, so he said, oh hell nah, and naturally got rid of him. Yep, as we've seen recently, All For One had the glowing baby's quirk, meaning at some point in the past, he killed him. All For One explains that 50 people in India were both born with quirks before the baby, and so he has no right to command so many people if he wasn't even the quirk progenitor. As we now know, All For One views himself as the quirk originator. When Yoichi asks his brother why he killed him, All For One says he did it like in the comics, as he was enthralled by them in a different way. In the comic, there was a line, one for all and all for one. So, All For One fell in love with that phrase. While a hero fights alone with the secret identity, the villain reigns through fear. It's here where he came to this conclusion that just like Yoichi has a dream of being a hero, he has a dream of creating a world where everything exists for his sake. This further solidifies All For One's mentality, and for the most part, everything fell in place just as he had willed. Anything he could ever want, wealth, fame, power, it all fell into the palm of All For One's hands. However, one thing was eventually taken from him. His little brother, Yoichi. And it was all thanks to the second user, Kudo. All For One thinks back to when Kudo took Yoichi's hand as they began to run away. While not the same, this heavily parallels Deku and Bakugo holding hands several times throughout the series. This further proves that holding hands has become a significant motif in the series, showcasing a strong bond. Even like Shigaraki's hands that he has all over his face at the beginning of the series from his parent, it was significant. Seeing his brother get a boyfriend without his approval makes All For One furious, so he demands the second user to bring him back, saying that Yoichi is his.
Shut your stupid.
He then proceeds to cut off his younger brother's hand, the one he was holding with Kudo. This man was jealous, holy shit. This action was the moment where Yoichi completely severed his bond with his brother, as it not only went against what he wanted, but is also some crazy symbolism. As remember, earlier in the chapter, Yoichi wanted to believe in the good of All For One because he held his hand as a baby. All For One severing it is basically him admitting that he can do no good. He is a true villain. This was when the moral dichotomy between one for all and all for one was truly realized, starting the conflict conflict that has persisted for over 100 years. In fact, this had such a deep psychological effect on All For One that many years later, when he needed a new vessel to possess, he looked for a boy that held some parallels to his own brother. Both Shigaraki and Yoichi had a dream to be a hero and were believed to have no powers. All For One purposefully targeted Tomura due to his relationship to Nana, but it was also a perfect parallel to what he had previously lost in his own brother. All For One gave Shigaraki the decay ability, which is why his body exhibits an extreme reaction of itching due to the rejection of this foreign quirk. But again, this was with intent, as giving a volatile power to a young troubled boy had a for sure outcome, which All For One had perfectly predicted. After the death of Shigaraki's family, he was scorned by society when he was in his lowest point, looked down upon as a ragged, unwanted child, where then All For One took the opportunity to place himself in Shigaraki's life to further manipulate him to change from a boy who was much like Yoichi to a monster who is like All For One. This was all done for the needed symbiosis, so All For One can take over Shigaraki completely, but through Shigaraki's scars, we can see All For One as the hand he was told to carry around, much like the hands that All For One cut off from Yoichi. While this chapter does give us a full-on backstory for All For One, I don't believe it's necessarily the most important thing we receive about him, as this chapter established why he hates the second user so much, and why Bakugo is the perfect foil for the strongest villain. Think about it this way. Your life is going great, you're married, have a bunch of kids, a nice house, a dog, everything is great. Then all of a sudden, a new person walks into your life, stealing your partner's feelings for you, and your kids start to see him as their parent in your place. Hell, even the dog likes them better. This is basically All For One, just on a way more extreme psychotic level. In his case, Yoichi represents the partner, kids, and dog. All For One still loved him in his own twisted, possessive way, and so he didn't like the idea of his thing being stolen. This is why he attacks and tries to kill Yoichi at the end of the chapter. His over-controlling nature saw it as Kudo stealing from him. Furthermore, All For One views One For All as an extension of his brother, often calling its users his brother when he sees them. So when we look at it with all this information, it makes perfect sense he wants this quirk so bad. In his mind, it isn't the power he could never steal, but something that was taken from him which he wants back. Kudo was the one to instigate Yoichi's betrayal in All For One's head. Without Kudo, All For One would have had everything. Yoichi would have never realized his ability to pass on quirks and would stay as his older brother's prisoner. All For One's criminal empire would continue to rise and he would truly ascend to the title of Demon King. But Kudo stole Yoichi. One For All was fully cultivated and a power to rival his own came into existence. For the past 100 plus years, All For One has had a grudge against Kudo for ruining his plans. We now also know why All For One was crying when he killed Kudo. They were most likely tears of joy and sadness for finally killing the one who stole his precious thing. As Bakugo has pointed out, All For One has already lost his mind when he addresses him as the second user. But this might actually have a deeper meaning and be the hint that everyone was looking for where Kudo may in fact be Bakugo's ancestor. Funnily enough, this chapter we also see a pan shot of Bakugo's mother, giving us a funny feeling that Kudo might have been from Bakugo's mother's side. Regardless, Bakugo reminding All For One of the second user has completely destroyed his mind, halting all logical thought, replaced with a strong desire to destroy our goat, meaning that Bakugo will be integral in All For One's downfall, perhaps maybe being the one to kill him. This would fully showcase Bakugo doesn't need One For All to be strong, that with just his sheer willpower and ferocity, he can stand as Deku's full equal. But to enjoy more peak fiction, check out the video on screen right now because it's another banger.